By the time he let go of my wrist in front of everyone, I realized the room was more offended by him than by what he'd done. A poor man touching a rich woman, even by accident, carried more weight than the sharpness of his grip. My family froze, elders stiff with disapproval, as if his poverty had suddenly become visible through his fingers. I adjusted my sari calmly, even though my heart was pounding, and met his eyes long enough to see apology and pride wrestling inside him. They had already told me not to look at him like that. My mother's voice echoed in my head, reminding me that affection was a dangerous habit, especially when directed downward across class lines. He stood beside me during the ceremony, barefooted like everyone else, yet somehow more exposed, as if the absence of wealth clung to him louder than any ornament. When our hands brushed during the ritual, he pulled away first, not because he didn't want to touch me, but because he didn't think he was allowed to. That night, he sat on the edge of the mattress, careful not to wrinkle the expensive sheets, like he was afraid the fabric itself might accuse him. "Your family won't like this," he said quietly, stating it like a fact, not a complaint. I laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it was already too late for approval. When I told him I had chosen him, not out of rebellion, but certainty, he looked at me like someone hearing a blessing they didn't believe they deserved. The next morning, my mother inspected him the way one inspects a weak investment. She asked about his education, his income, his future, all with polite smiles sharpened by calculation. He answered honestly, never exaggerating, never apologizing, and I noticed how his voice didn't shake even when hers grew colder. Later, she pulled me aside and whispered that love does not feed families, and I replied gently that neither does pride when it starves the soul. The house quickly learned to treat him like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. Servants hesitated, relatives whispered, and every shared meal felt like a test he hadn't studied for. Yet he thanked everyone, helped without being asked, and refused to be small even when the room wanted him to shrink. Watching him, I understood something quietly terrifying and beautiful. Wealth had given me comfort, but it was his character that taught me courage. At breakfast, he sat straighter than anyone else at the table, as if posture alone could make up for the lack of pedigree everyone pretended not to notice. My aunt asked him whether his village even had proper schools, her smile thin and falsely curious, and I felt his jaw tighten before he answered calmly that learning did not disappear, just because money did. I reached for the chutney and placed it closer to him without looking, a small act that felt louder than any defense. He glanced at me, surprised, and for a moment the room shifted, unsettled by how easily I chose him without announcement. Later that day, my mother lectured me gently, which was always more dangerous than shouting. She reminded me of our ancestors, our lands, the responsibilities that came with being born into comfort, and she asked whether I truly understood what I was giving up. I listened patiently, nodding because I did understand. I understood that love chosen freely was heavier than love arranged safely. When I told her that dignity mattered more to me than display, she looked at me as if I were speaking a language she had forgotten how to hear. He tried to distance himself after that, out of what he called respect, but what I recognized as fear. He stopped sitting beside me, stopped reaching for my hand in quiet moments, and spoke to me like someone trying not to leave fingerprints behind. One evening, I asked him whether loving me felt like stealing something that wasn't his, and his silence answered more honestly than words ever could. I smiled softly and told him that I had never belonged to anyone else to be stolen from. The women of the household watched us closely, whispering theories into cups of tea. Some said I was naive, others said I was stubborn, and a few said I would regret this once reality settled in. I greeted them all the same way, with warmth and politeness, refusing to argue because arguments made people defensive, not thoughtful. Slowly, a few of them began to soften, noticing how he never interrupted elders, never raised his voice, and always stood up when someone entered the room. One afternoon, he repaired a broken gate near the servants' quarters without being asked. It was a small thing, but it caught the attention of my grandfather, who believed work revealed character more reliably than conversation. "He doesn't behave like a guest," my grandfather remarked quietly later, and I smiled because that was the highest compliment in this house. When my husband heard about it, he looked embarrassed, as if decency itself were something he wasn't meant to display openly. Money became the quiet shadow following us everywhere. When relatives discussed vacations, investments, and renovations, he listened politely without adding anything, his hands folded neatly in his lap. I noticed how he never pretended to understand things he didn't, and never exaggerated things he did, which somehow made his silence feel heavier than their loud confidence. That night, I told him that being honest about what you don't have was braver than pretending to have everything, and for the first time he laughed freely, like someone unburdening himself. My cousin tried to test him once, offering help finding a better job, her tone dripping with condescension masked as concern. He thanked her sincerely and said he would earn his growth, not borrow it, and the room went uncomfortably quiet. I watched faces shift, some impressed, some irritated, and realized that humility unsettled people more than arrogance ever could. When he caught my eye afterward, I gave him a small thumbs up behind my glass, and he had to hide a smile. We learned to steal moments where class did not matter. Sitting on the terrace at night, sharing roasted peanuts, laughing quietly about how seriously everyone took themselves, we felt almost weightless. He told me stories about his childhood, about sharing textbooks and fixing things instead of replacing them, and I listened like someone discovering a different kind of wealth. I realized then that love didn't make us equal, it made us curious about each other's worlds. The elders began to argue openly about our future, as if we weren't in the room. They discussed children, inheritance, and reputation, their words sharp with concern disguised as wisdom. He stared at the floor, clearly uncomfortable, and I reached for his hand deliberately this time, letting everyone see. The room went silent, not because I had defied them loudly, but because I had done so calmly, without apology. That night he asked me whether I would resent him one day for the comfort I had lost. The question was quiet, almost afraid, and I answered just as softly that resentment grows when people lie to themselves, not when they choose honestly. I told him I had chosen him knowing exactly who he was and who he was not. He exhaled slowly, like someone finally setting down a burden he'd been carrying alone. Slowly, things shifted not dramatically but noticeably. My mother stopped correcting his manners. My grandfather started asking his opinion on practical matters, and servants grew less hesitant around him. No one announced acceptance, but acceptance in this house was never announced. It arrived through small permissions. I watched him relax, just a little, as if the walls had moved an inch farther away. One morning, I found him teaching my youngest cousin how to repair a cracked chair. The child listened with wide-eyed fascination, unconcerned with status or money, only impressed by skill. My aunt watched from the doorway, conflicted, and I saw something soften in her expression. It was hard to argue against goodness when it looked so ordinary. When a family function required donations, he quietly contributed what he could without explanation. It wasn't much compared to others, but he gave without hesitation or shame. My mother noticed, and later told me that generosity measured by sacrifice was different from generosity measured by excess. I smiled, knowing she was closer to understanding than she realized. He still struggled with pride, sometimes pulling away when conversations turned to money, sometimes insisting he didn't deserve certain comforts. I learned to meet him halfway, refusing to let him shrink while also respecting his boundaries. Love, I realized, was not about erasing difference, but about standing steady inside it together. One evening, as we walked through the courtyard lit with oil lamps, he squeezed my hand and said, almost shyly, "Thank you for choosing me the way I am." I squeezed back and replied, "Thank you for being someone worth choosing." The lamps flickered, the house breathed quietly around us, and for the first time, the future felt less like a battlefield and more like a shared path. The next family gathering was larger, louder, and filled with relatives who had heard just enough gossip to be curious but not enough to be kind. He stayed close to me, polite and reserved, answering questions with honesty that made some people uncomfortable. When one uncle joked that love doesn't pay bills, he smiled and replied that neither did bitterness, and a few people laughed despite themselves. I felt a warm flutter in my chest, the kind that comes from quiet pride rather than loud triumph. My mother invited me to sit with her one afternoon, folding saris the way she always did when she needed time to think. She asked whether I was happy, Not sharply, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. I told her that happiness felt calmer than she had warned me it would be. Less dramatic and more steady. She didn't respond right away, only smoothed the silk in her hands. And I sensed that her resistance was no longer rooted in fear for me, but in fear of being wrong. He began waking early to help around the house, careful not to draw attention to himself. Some mornings, I found him in the courtyard watering plants, humming softly to himself like he'd forgotten where he was. It was strangely endearing, this small rebellion against self-consciousness, and I teased him once about becoming the house gardener. He laughed, truly laughed, and told me plants didn't care how much money you had, only whether you showed up consistently. Not everyone's soft. My aunt continued to comment on how difficult my life must be now, emphasizing every word like a warning. I responded with exaggerated seriousness, thanking her for her concern and telling her I discovered that difficulty was just comfort wearing a different face. She looked baffled, and I had to bite my lip to keep from smiling. Watching rigid minds struggle with new ideas became a quiet source of amusement. One evening, he confessed that attending these gatherings exhausted him more than physical labor ever had. I told him it was because judgment weighs more than work, and he nodded like that explained everything. We shared tea on the steps, feet touching lightly, watching the sky darken into a familiar indigo. In those moments, it felt like the world had shrunk to something manageable. Something kind. A conversation about inheritance erupted during dinner one night, voices rising as plates cooled. Someone suggested that tradition demanded certain sacrifices, and all eyes flickered briefly toward me. I waited, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make people uncomfortable, before calmly asking why tradition never seemed to require kindness. The table fell quiet, and I felt his hand brush mine under the table, grounding and grateful. My grandfather began asking him to accompany him on walks through the fields. At first, they spoke little, but gradually their conversations deepened, moving from crops to labor to responsibility. One evening, my grandfather remarked that wealth was easier to inherit than respect, and my husband listened as if those words were meant just for him. I watched from a distance, heart full, knowing acceptance often came disguised as mentorship. The servants started treating him differently too, not because they were told to, but because he treated them like equals. He learned their names quickly, listened to their concerns, and never dismissed them. One of them told me quietly that goodness was obvious when it didn't try to impress. I carried that sentence with me like a small blessing. My mother finally spoke to him alone one afternoon. I didn't hear the conversation, but when he returned, his shoulders were less tense, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. Later, she told me he reminded her of her own father before wealth softened his edges. That comparison, spoken softly, felt like a door opening rather than closing. At a temple festival, he insisted on standing at the back, uncomfortable with the stairs. I took his hand and pulled him forward gently, ignoring the murmurs. When someone whispered that he didn't belong there, I smiled sweetly and said devotion wasn't measured by donation receipts. The whispering stopped, replaced by something closer to respect. He surprised me one night by admitting he had started saving for something important. When I asked what, he shrugged and said he wanted to contribute equally someday, even if it took time. I told him equality didn't mean matching numbers. It meant matching intent. And he looked relieved, like someone released from an invisible competition. My cousin apologized to him unexpectedly, admitting she had misjudged him. Her voice was awkward, embarrassed, but sincere. He accepted with grace, not gloating, not dismissive, just kind. Watching him handle reconciliation better than those raised to power made me realize how deeply character was shaped by struggle. One afternoon, my mother asked me whether love always had to be so complicated. I told her it only felt complicated when people tried to control it. She laughed softly, a sound I hadn't heard in a long time, and said perhaps she had forgotten how much courage simplicity required. He started teaching me small practical skills, fixing switches, repairing furniture, understanding things money usually replaced. I teased him about turning me into a commoner, and he teased me back about finally learning real value. Our laughter echoed through the halls, and for once no one tried to quiet us. The family stopped discussing alternatives for my future. Not because they were convinced, but because reality had settled in gently and refused to leave. Love had not shouted them into agreement. It had simply stayed. Watching that acceptance unfold taught me that endurance could be persuasive without being forceful. He admitted one night that he no longer felt like he was trespassing. The house still intimidated him, but it no longer made him shrink. I told him homes weren't claimed by wealth, but by care, and he rested his head against my shoulder like that truth was finally safe to believe. My grandfather announced that responsibility would now be shared differently, emphasizing effort over entitlement. The room shifted. Some pleased, some unsettled. My husband met my eyes briefly, gratitude and disbelief mingling, and I knew this was not a reward but recognition. As time passed, our differences became less threatening and more complementary. He brought grounding where I brought perspective, patience where I brought optimism. We learned that love didn't flatten us into sameness, but sharpened us into balance. One evening, sitting together beneath the quiet glow of the courtyard lamps, he said he no longer felt poor when he was with me. I smiled and told him I had never felt richer than in moments like this, where choice mattered more than inheritance. The house stood around us, old and watchful, finally learning that love could belong anywhere it was brave enough to stay.